Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Birth Neoterist space. I am Sabia, your host, and I'm always excited to have every conversation, but I'm very excited about this conversation today. So, Mara, do you want to introduce yourself in any ways that feels good to you today?
Sure, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. My name is Maura Bobbitt, and I am based in San Antonio, Texas. And I guess the easiest way to classify what I do is I'm a death care reform activist, I suppose you could say.
Yes. So, what has that included? What is your process? What you've been doing? What you up to?
Yeah, so I am currently a student in the San Antonio College Mortuary Science program. And I'm a little over a year into their 2-year program to get licensed as a funeral director and embalmer. Um, but it's been quite a journey. I was sort of in denial about having to get this license and was hoping to sort of figure out a way around it. But unfortunately, in the state of Texas, I realized that I had to just bite the bullet and get this license to do the work that I want to do. So that's kind of where I'm at with it right now. But the big dream that I have is just sort of for people to live in awareness of their mortality. And I'm
Hmm.
sort of open to accomplishing that in whatever ways come up. So I've kind of got a lot of irons in the fire, I guess you could say.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh. So I definitely over the last couple of years, I've been getting, I'm more heavily into death work than I am necessarily like birth work. Um, and that's one of the things I was like, damn it, do I have to become a funeral director? Like, do I have to do like this? I don't want to do that. Like in a sense, I just want to
Yeah.
go to school, right? Like I really like the process, you know what I mean? But
Oh,
so glad
yeah.
that you're doing it because it's so necessary. So okay. So I want to ask a couple questions to kind of build some context around the thing. Because I had one question, but I was like, let's build context first. So, what is a funeral director? Like, what do funeral directors do? Is the first question.
That's a great question. So there's a dual license that is there's a funeral director license and then there's the embalming license. You A lot of people have both just because it makes you more employable. But basically, what a funeral director does is they make all of the arrangements for a funeral service. So if a family experiences a loss, they come into the funeral home and the funeral director sits down with them in what's called an arrangement conference, which is where you find out, if the person left wishes for what they wanted, how they wanted to be buried or cremated, what kind of service they want, and the funeral director makes all of those arrangements for them.
Got it. Okay. So, one of the things I also would love for you to get in a little bit into is one of the things that I learned around being a funeral director was specifically like signing off on death certificates.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, so can you explain like what that is so that then we can get to my next question. Because then we're gonna get into the shits. So
Yeah. So there's a lot of paperwork around dying.
Mhm.
And yeah, so the funeral director is also responsible for making sure that all the paperwork is being filed. Like the death certificate, for example, has to be filed within 10 days, things like that. You have to get a burial transit permit, all sorts of things. Filing that a death has occurred with the Social Security Administration.
And you
Lots
need
and
all
lots.
these things so that because there's like a process to dying, right? Like of course there is an actual physical dying that happens, but now it's like how do we close this chapter of your existence in the world, right? Like how do we
Exactly.
finalize that?
Closing bank accounts, all those kinds of things, and any property. There's so much to navigate. So something that a lot of people don't know is that you are actually not required to use a funeral director when you experience a death. But because there are all of these laws and all of this paperwork, it's really, really difficult for people to have home funerals within their own family and not accidentally break the law. So
Hmm.
funeral directors have sort of become a requirement because of all of this sort of red tape that exists around death.
So that's
But
like, go ahead, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so like a big part of why I am getting licensed is to remove those barriers as much as possible for people. I really want to help
Yes.
people facilitate home funerals and basically do the least, so that people can actually take on more of the dying process and ceremony themselves and sort of
Hmm.
empower them to do as much as they're comfortable with. And I'll
Hmm.
do the parts that they either can't do or don't want to do.
For sure. And I think like so many things, right? Like one, traditionally, most of us died in our homes.
Right.
Like we died in our homes. We had a service in our community, whether it was at home or maybe, another community space. Like that's how dying happened. And then like, I do a lot of work with the medical industrial complex, right? So now with the
Mm-hmm.
medical industrial complex, now people are dying mostly in the hospital system.
Mm-hmm.
Even in spaces where like not for nothing, but you're just old, right? Like there's no like sometimes it's like complicated, of course, right? Like things happen, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's like this person is 92. They should probably just be home.
Right.
Really? Like, but again, we have like this, it's a lot of stuff that's built up to this time. But one of the things that really like pops out to me as far as like being a funeral director and which like sparked my brain rush. Should I become a funeral director? And that's like also I'm a Sagittarius. So like if I see something, I'm like, do I need to do that? Because I love to learn. I'll just go do it.
Yeah.
But anyways, one of the things that was very interesting to me, I was doing my Going with Grace doula training, deaf doula training, and we were talking about the different ways that people can get buried, right? So like most people are not even aware of the fact that there's so many different burial options that
Mm-hmm.
are one, more eco-friendly, that are two, more affordable. Three, and it just gives people options like how do you want to go? Do you want to do it by water? Do you want to do it by this? Do you want to do it by this? Like, people are just usually kind of like either I'm gonna get cremated or I'm gonna have a traditional funeral that's gonna put my family most likely in debt if I don't have insurance and things to cover it, right? So one of the things that we were talking about in that space was like some people are, of course we have a long way to go, I think, in the deaf space, but like some people are, um, that was my baby mom calling me, of course. But anyway, some people are learning these different ways of dying and like learning about these different options, which means that now the funeral industry in specific is not making the money that they were making before. And I've even heard of funeral directors charging people four figures or more just to sign a death certificate. Because they're like, we're not going to make money from this big, huge, like the casket and the this and the that. People are simplifying. So now it's like, you need me to do this paperwork. So I'm going to charge you a high base to be able to cover the things that are now, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not as easy to milk as it was before.
Absolutely. And that is, I mean, the way that funeral costs and contracts are regulated is it's very specific, and it's regulated by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, by the funeral rule, which was introduced in 1984. And it has all these like really specific ways that everything has to be itemized and charged. And there's a thing called the basic services fee, which cannot be, the family can't, it's not a choice whether or not they pay it. Everything else is a choice, and they have to decide like if you want a casket or if you want this or that,
Mhm.
but they are not
Mhm.
allowed to decline the basic services fee. And that tends to be around $2,000 on average for, and that includes, it depends on what that is. Like each funeral home can decide what's included in that, but it's one of the only ways that we're allowed to recoup like overhead costs. So
Mhm.
yeah, a lot of, and but it includes the filing of the paperwork, usually transport of the body, going to pick it up and bringing it back to the funeral home, things like that. But there are also funeral homes like Recompose in Seattle, Katrina's
Yes.
Faith,
Mhm. Mhm.
amazing natural
Mhm.
organic reduction. they don't charge a basic service fee. There's a zero. So there is sort of wiggle room within that for people that don't want to do that,
Hmm.
for ethical reasons. So
But like
yeah, I
funerals
definitely
in
don't.
themselves, like funerals will make people go broke.
Yeah,
Like,
behind buying a house, it is the largest expense for most families that they will ever incur.
and
And it's
it's like,
often unexpected, and it's very rarely, I mean, the average, it depends on where you look, but people on average are spending about $7,000 to $8,000 on a funeral.
and that's like, and it's probably more of a smaller funeral than like
Yeah.
a large funeral.
I mean, it's hard to get a casket for less than $1,000. Um, then you have the basic services fee. So you're already at $3,000 there. And that's without even factoring in how much you're paying for the actual burial space, like the grave plot. Um,
Yes.
so yeah, it's very expensive to die. And it's just so not the way it should be.
Yes. And then we
Yeah.
also like, I think like, to also get into that, I think when I was in Going with Grace, like that was probably one of the first times I heard of like, I mean, because people get embalmed, that's just the process, that's what people do. But that's probably like the first place where like you don't have to be embalmed. And I was like,
Right.
oh, I didn't really think about that. Like I just because it's like right, like you grow up, people die, you go to the funeral, you learn this is the funeral process, you go like you know what I mean? Like there is no
Yeah.
deviation from that. And so even just like those simple things where you're like, it costs this much to get embalmed, but you don't have to be embalmed. It's like,
Yeah.
because I think about it, I'm like, I personally, but one, I just want to be burned. Like just burn me up, put me around some trees or whatever. Like I'll be
I
fine.
know.
Like
I
I
wish
don't.
open pyres were legal. That would be really cool.
Yeah, yeah, like just put me on like make a celebration. Let's have a whole like, whatever. But like I'm like when I think about it, if that wasn't the option, I personally wouldn't want to get embalmed because I'm just like, let's just be done with it. We don't
I
gotta
think
do all of this.
a lot of people too don't know what the embalming process actually looks like. And it's very invasive. The chemicals that are used are very dangerous for the embalmers. They cause
Yes.
cancer. Not to mention, I mean, just when I'm in my like embalming lab or my anatomy lab, I have a headache by the time I leave that room from all the chemicals that I'm being exposed to. I
Hmm.
don't intend to ever embalm. It's like you said, not a requirement, and a lot of people don't know that. But unfortunately, like mortuary science schools are not teaching alternatives. Like they're not teaching you how to safely care for bodies without embalming.
Hmm.
A lot of my professors don't really even know the laws. Like I have one professor that just keeps saying in class that you can't legally have a viewing without being embalmed, and that's not true. It's a funeral home policy, and I'm sitting there in class listening to him say something that's just not true, that affects my
Hmm.
life so deeply, and I'm like boiling with rage. um
Yes, yes. And
so
I think like
it's
there's so much too to say about like how activism is everywhere. Like, so one of the things I guess I can compare it to is like when I became a doula and I started working with incarcerated people,
mm,
like that was one of the things that it was kind of like it was such a forgotten space, right? People aren't thinking about who's pregnant in prison, like they just aren't, right? Me included.
yeah.
Like I'm one of many that wasn't thinking about that. And so like I think about death in the same way. Like it's such a hidden industry that like you don't really talk about it until something has happened, right? And because
Hmm.
of that, because there's not the normalization of death conversations and normalization of what do you want, how do you want your body to be treated when you die? What is this, right? Because such an avoidance in that makes that capitalism aspect of it so much easier to, invade people because you just don't know until you know, and you don't know until you're in crisis. So now you're in crisis. You're having feelings of grief, right? Loss, whatever the case may be, especially if it's unexpected. And now someone's just like, this is what you do. Like,
It's interesting that you brought up working with incarcerated people right now, because just this week I don't know what made me think of it, but I started thinking like what happens to incarcerated people when they die in prison? Where are they buried? And here in Texas, they go to what Joe Bird Cemetery. It's the largest cemetery for incarcerated people in the country, and it's about 4 hours from where I live. And it's at the same, like the actually incarcerated people historically have dug the graves. There's like a special group of people. It's called the Walls Unit. That come and they like dig the graves. They act as mourners because often the family can't afford to come.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it seems to be, it seems like a, there's room for improvement. And so I would really, really love to, after I graduate, go work for the funeral home that handles that contract because I think that could be done in such a beautiful way.
Yeah. And
Um,
I think like people, we just, there's not, I mean, we like, as a birth doula, right? Like, obviously, I've like, really cherished the, the physical entering of like another soul on this planet and how like, you know, wonderful and just so deep that process can be to be like, oh shit, like there's a kid here all of a sudden, like there's a baby here all of a sudden, like that's wild, right? But also like death deserves to be handled in that same way.
yeah,
Um,
I agree.
it's
Like,
like
why
how
don't
do
we have like,
we
oh,
Mhm, go
sorry,
ahead.
you go.
No, why don't we have what?
Why don't we have like death registries in the same way that we have birth registries and wedding registries? Like
Yeah,
why aren't we helping each other pay for this stuff?
because it's expensive. And it's also
Yeah.
like I think because of the way that so I'm like I'm super excited because I'm actually going to be in Mexico City during the week of Day of the Dead. And like I'm super excited to be there during that time because like obviously, right? Like I want to like be in the vibe of like people like celebrating death and celebrating that process.
Yeah.
Because when you celebrate death, you're also celebrating life. Like that's just it's just one of, it's just a cycle. But I feel like especially in the US because we don't practice, dying at home or having more community centered like funeral processes. Like I think that also creates like because we skip that process, a lot of us don't see death. We don't see any of it. It also leaves like these wounds of like emptiness because you haven't it's like when you see a birth, it's like something that you can never being there for a birth and being blessed to be in that space is something that like it helps you understand life at such a deeper magnitude because you're like, I was there when the baby was coming out. You know what I mean? Like, right, the energy in the room, the feeling that was going around, the things that were releasing, the even the, the birthing parents' energetic releases, like everything comes up in that space. And then it's like death happens and we do it in the dark, right? And I feel
Hmm.
like that should be it's a healing process for the people around the dying person as well, just to be in the presence is, so a place that you're comfortable, but like prior to, like it was like you would if someone died in your family, you would help clean their body up. You
Yeah.
would, put their favorite outfit on them. You would leave them in your house. Like you
Yeah.
would put some ice packs around, let them like be in a space. Like it was like, and I think that process is something that we need on a like a soul level that
I
we've just
agree.
been missing as as the world, as just people in the world. And so like I think it also creates um like kind of like a unappreciation for life because you haven't
Hmm.
seen death. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah. I have come to believe that sort of the American death denial is at the core of a lot of our problems as a society. I really
But if you
think,
knew that you could die, like we know you could die at any moment, but if you knew what it looked like to die of certain things or certain whatever, certain stressors or certain, you would be like, oh, we need to fix this now. Like,
absolutely. And even just the way that we live our day-to-day lives, like if we're not when you are orienting yourself through the lens of I'm a mortal thing that will die and my time is limited. And so is, the person in front of me in traffic, their time is limited. All of a sudden, all of these things that are stressing us out or making us be rude really don't matter as much. either, you know?
Exactly.
And I
Exactly. And I felt
also,
that way working in the medical space. So before I became a doula, I was working as a nursing assistant. And I would just see people that like had been through the ringer. You know what I'm saying? Like whether it was
absolutely.
something that was like cancer or if it was something that was unexpected or an accident. And you start to look at shit like, yo, like nothing is promised. like like the next minute is not promised. The next hour is not promised. Like you can be as safe
Exactly.
as you want to and then have a massive heart attack unexpectedly. Like to
Mm-hmm.
have that kind of like to see that things do end, that life does end on a close, magnifying glass, I feel like it changes you at your
It
core.
does. And it's a gift too. I think
Hmm.
that a lot of people don't think about actually the beauty of it. And that because we die, it gives so much meaning to our lives. It gives meaning to every moment. And, like that feeling when you look at something like a really beautiful flower that
Hmm.
is not going to last for very long and it's beautiful and you love it, but there's this almost like sad melancholiness when you see the most beautiful things because you can't keep it forever. Um, I mean, it just lends so much beauty to our lives and we don't understand it. We don't know what happens, but we do know that.
Yeah. And it's like even like the simplicity, I think sometimes people think that death is so far away from them, but really like even now I'm like looking over at because before we started our conversation, I have like a whole bunch of plants over here, like 6 plants, something like that. Yeah. And I'm looking at, 'cause, it's beginning to be fall. And so I'm looking at like some of them are just dying because it's time to preserve energy. So it's like, oh, you're just dying over there, right? Like it's like death is around you
Yeah.
24/7, right? In some facet. And also the reality is that we're always dying. We as people, as
Mm-hmm.
soon as you're born, you are always dying.
Yep.
So it's like, how do we, I guess like what are your ideas around having more of that conversation? And I think maybe even specifically in your role as a funeral director, because you really do have the ability to change the way that people die and how people's family members have to deal
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think there's a lot of sort of education that has to happen, like before people are going to come to me and ask for a home funeral. So I'm doing that in some different ways. I mean, for one thing, I'm just like out in my community talking about it all the time. And
You're that
like at
person.
weddings, like I'm the one who's just like, what do you want to happen to you when you die? um, but I'm developing a curriculum with this a friend of mine who has a company called Blooming with Birdie, and she does sort of immersive, interactive educational experiences for kids. And we're working on a death curriculum for kids,
Mm,
where they will learn about like decomposition from a scientific standpoint, like what is it, and like the fact that we can't have new life without death and without like soil breaking down. So they're going to learn about
mhm.
soil. They're going to grow mushrooms because mushrooms are decomposers.
Mhm.
They only grow on like decaying material. And then they're going to grow like a plant, and then they're finally going to have a little ecosystem in a jar that they
Oh,
make
I
where the
love
science
that.
goes on.
Kids are
So
so fascinated with death. My 5-year-old is always like, this died and this, and I'm like, oh Jesus, yes, it
yeah,
died.
and like people are scared to talk to them about it, but like they know, they get it.
Hmm.
So and then we're gonna try and like figure out, it's the audience for that is going to be like the peers of kids who have experienced loss. So
Got
we have
it.
this really awesome organization in San Antonio called the Children's Bereavement Center of South Texas.
Hmm.
So they have like groups and grief therapists that work with kids that have experienced loss. Um,
And I will
so
say too, like to that note, like as a kid, so my dad was killed when I was 13. To
mm,
that note, like I also think that some of my interest in death is like when you're a child and you experience bereavement at a young age, it's like when I like as a grown person now, how old am I? I'm 34. Like I have to remember because I don't remember. But like as a person who's like 34 and like have, friends and family who's like I haven't had major deaths in my life, I'm
yeah,
like really? Because I'm like, baby, it started early for me. Like it was just like that was just a part of the programming, right? Like, but
Yeah.
yeah, I can't even imagine. Like, I mean, I can imagine because I've lived through it, but I can only imagine how impactful the work is
I think,
around
yeah,
normalizing that.
being a kid, if experiencing loss, it's so isolating because your peers just have no idea. It's like your mind's just been blown open and you've seen this reality that they haven't
Mm-hmm.
even started to think about. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's why I want to focus on the peers and to create sort of a safe space to talk about death and to give shared language and to also say like, here are the things, like I want to interview some of these kids from the bereavement center on
Mm-hmm.
to and say like, what are some things that are helpful to hear, what are some things that aren't helpful to hear,
Mm-hmm.
just so that like people's like their classmates, or it could even be, I don't know, some like the Boy Scouts
Yeah.
with or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, they can all watch these videos and go through this process together and then
So you
hopefully.
are you were definitely the odd duckling. Like when you're like when my dad died and everyone, because you know you're out of school for a little bit because you got to do the whole thing, whatever, and then you go back to school and everybody's like, mm, like, are you
They're
okay?
scared of you almost.
Yeah, they're like, are you? Should
Yeah.
we talk about this? Should we not talk about? And it's everyone, right? It's the kids, the teachers, it's everyone is on that line of like, how do we talk about this or what do we do, or let's just pretend everything is normal, but also you can never be normal again because you just had a loss as a child, like
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, I think that'll be hopefully impactful. And then I also am working with a curator friend of mine, and we're putting on a show, an art exhibition next year called Death Rights. Um, and that's just like another way that I'm trying to like reach people and kind of like educate the community and create conversation around it. So I'm kind of, like I said, I have a lot of irons in the fire, and I'm just
Hmm.
like throwing a lot of stuff at the wall and hoping something sticks.
But
And
all of
just
it's
kind of,
necessary, right? Like all of it's necessary, like whether I think, and that's the thing about death and any topic I suppose, but it's like being able to filter it through different lenses. So like art, and filter through growing a garden, and filter through these things because it's literally everywhere. So it's like, but bringing that to the light and be like, hey, this is something that we can talk about death, not. And I think people sometimes get confused because you know how like if you go to like a death cafe, right? Like you're not
mm-hmm,
necessarily, it's not a bereavement group. Like you're not going there necessarily to talk about a death that happened. You're really there to talk about the concept of death. Like what does it mean to you? What have you seen? Right. And I think like we just need to have more of that in ways that people
mm-hmm,
can like ingest it, whether it's art or this or that, around just like what does death mean to you? Like how does it feel to think about your own death? Or because we also know there's a fear of death, right? Like people are constantly, which I think is interesting. I think a lot of people fear death, and I don't know if you see this, but I also feel like sometimes people fear death so much that they hurt themselves and it goes faster to death. Like I don't know. Like I'm
mm,
like,
yeah, for
like,
sure.
like you're so avoidant of it that now you're building up these coping mechanisms that are not good for you that are leaning into death. But
Yeah.
like,
It's interesting too, seeing like when I tell people what I do, a lot of the majority of people are like really fascinated by it, and it's like they're like hungry to talk about it, but there are definitely some people that I see them wanting to step away from me, like they don't want to talk to me anymore, they think I'm weird. um
I mean, maybe you are a little weird, maybe,
yeah.
but like it's okay. We all are. So what are your like top challenges currently, like in school and like with the things that you're moving through?
I mean, it's nothing but challenges, honestly. It's hard. I'm really, to be frank, just struggling. Um,
Mhm.
in my classes and in school because I'm not learning about how to do things the way I want to do them. I'm learning how to do the things that I want to change desperately.
Mm,
And just
mhm,
having to like be surrounded by it all the time. And it's like really, really frustrating. And
mhm,
it's almost like I'm going through the stages of grief in a way. Like in this program, I go through times where I'm like, where I'm feeling connected, but right now I'm like in an anger phase,
mhm,
where like I feel I need to be careful that I don't burn myself out because I'm just like filled with rage all the time. This has been going on
Hmm.
for like 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I
I
mean,
mean, I think
it's,
anytime you're in a system, right? Like, and it sucks, but it's like the path to change, learning how the old system operated. Like
yeah,
you do need to understand it, but it's so infuriating when you know that things can be different, when you know that it shouldn't cost this much, when you know it shouldn't cost people so much mental, physical, financial draining for them to bury a person that they love, right? Like
yeah,
the politics, right? And I think like the politics in itself is draining. Because I'm
yeah.
sure there's a whole bunch of like boards, like you said, that created this rule and that rule. And you're like, but who created that and for who to benefit from that? Because most people are not going to benefit from that.
Yeah. When I think it can be disheartening to like think about all the things that need to change, but it's also like there's so much opportunity for change and a lot of people aren't thinking about this. And so I really
Hmm.
feel like it's like this
Hmm.
way in for
Hmm.
social justice for so many different things. And like I can own one part of it, but there's so much work for the whole community and so
Hmm.
much change. Like one a man that I have so much admiration for here in San Antonio is a man named Everett Fly, who has been working on historic designations for like historic Black cemeteries in
Hmm.
town, which have been, just neglected and ignored for a long time. And so he's like reclaiming these spaces in this like
Love
really
that.
amazing way.
I love that.
And yeah, so there's just so much opportunity within the death world for positive change. And it's just something that like when you talk about it, it hits people like straight in the heart, like it
Yeah.
opens them up. And it's I think really a silver bullet that we can
Hmm.
use
And I think there's so
for
much,
positive
especially like
change.
in what you said about Everett. Like I, especially as a Black person, just thinking about like, like the mistreatment of Black people, obviously historically in the US, and also like knowing that when they died, it was also like, we don't give a fuck, right? So like
Yeah.
to be able to like reclaim that and know where your ancestor was buried or to know some information about them, right? Like I think that like as a Black person, a Black American, like that's one of the things that has is a healing for people that are, not that were not did not ask to be over in this land, but are and but still deal with
Hmm.
bullshit just to be like, yeah, like my great great aunt did get buried over there, and that was her like I think that can be such a healing aspect, and like yeah, just how because in this month that we're talking about death and all that, we're talking about like ancestral healing, and I can just see that
Hmm.
being such like a big step in ancestral healing.
Absolutely. Because it's also like we were here. You can't deny we were here because our
Mm-hmm.
bodies are here in the ground.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so he's actually where I don't know where this, I should have looked this up before our interview, but
Mm-hmm.
he has been working on a joint resolution for the United States House of Representatives to change the rules about how cemeteries are designated as historic cemeteries because currently you have to have all of the information like name, age, birthplace for like everybody buried in the
Yeah,
cemetery in order to get the designation,
and
but
you're not gonna
that
get that
information is not
for
available
yeah,
for like slave cemeteries or
yeah,
like indigenous cemeteries. So he's
yeah.
trying to change that so that we can designate these spaces even though we don't necessarily know who's in them like by name. So like
Wow, that's he doing
I
some
mean,
work.
doesn't
He
it
doing
just
some
give you
work.
chills?
Yeah,
Like it's so
he's doing
amazing.
some work. I'm like, woo, okay, all right. No, he's doing some work. Especially like it's just so much energy. Like what a cemetery where slaves were buried. Like that's so energetically. I can't even imagine like just standing on
And
that ground.
a lot of those cemeteries are on people's ranches. They're on like private land in Texas. So it's like this whole other thing. And it's actually how I got into this work was from the
Hmm.
cemetery angle because we have so many rights that people don't realize they have. Um, and you cannot restrict access to a cemetery. Like once
Hmm.
there are bodies buried there, once you've designated it, the ancestors, the descendants, of
Mm-hmm.
the people buried there have access to that land for the rest of time. You cannot restrict them
Mm.
from that land.
So now I
So,
see
I
why
mean,
there's like a pushback on changing things. So then it would mean that a lot of these places would now be open to descendants and to public.
mhm.
Mm,
Yeah, of
that's a
course,
lot.
people don't want to be like, yeah, sure, open up my private land to like whoever wants to come. But the thing is that it's not theirs.
Yeah,
You
that
know,
part.
that's not your
That
land.
part. Girl, you
So
saying
it's like
something
it's
now.
a
You saying
really
something.
powerful tool, really powerful tool.
Yes. You got to send a link over for that. You got to send
I
a link
will,
over for
yeah.
that.
I'll give you his
Yeah.
information for sure. He's amazing.
Yes. That's some deep work. That is some
He's been doing it for
deep,
a long time. He and my
yeah, that is
grandmother
some deep work.
actually worked together to preserve some cemeteries like on the east side of San Antonio. So
Hmm.
he's been at it a long time.
Wow. Well, when you think about the future, right? So the future of the work that you do, the death industry, the funeral industry, however you want to put it into a box, but what do you want that future to include?
Ooh, um, you know, the the simplest answer is freedom. I want people to be able to have the ceremonies and practices that bring them peace and comfort. That's really
Hmm.
what I want. And I think that
Hmm.
that can look a lot of different ways, but yeah, that's all I want to do is like help facilitate that for people and remove the barriers to that, whether they're financial or legal. I just really want to make it. I just want to increase access to meaningful
Yeah.
death care.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I
you
also
know,
like the word that comes up in my head when like just thinking about you and the work that you're doing is like there's a I don't know, I guess like right, birth and death is always like standing at the portal, right? You're always on this
yeah,
like portal, whatever. And I feel like birth is like you're kind of there during the presence of the opening of that portal and like whatever. But I feel like death is kind of like the completion of that, the closure of it. And it feels like your work is to help people actually be in completion. And I feel like a lot of people, at least people I know in my community, when people die, there's no completion because either they had the funeral, but they can't pay for the funeral. So now there's bills racking up for that. Maybe they didn't have support on how to close the accounts over here, close accounts over there. So now that's still open. Like there's like maybe they had an insurance policy that still has to be fair. It's like it's all these open things. And so people don't get to actually like be in a phase of completion because far after
yeah,
the person passes away there's still bills to pay, things to figure out, complications, there's debt, there's all these things. And like that's one of the things that tends to bother me the most about like the dying process outside of the physical aspect is like people don't ever get to see that process be completed.
absolutely, yeah. And yeah, there's so many ways that it could be so much cheaper and so much more beautiful. Like in Texas, anyway, we can be buried legally on private land. Um, so like in your
Did you
backyard.
see that? Did you see that article when someone was like, I forgot I think this lady like buried her mom in the backyard, and everybody's just like, oh, it was like a whole like news thing, and I was like,
I
that's what
didn't
people
see
used
that.
to do. They used to just bury their people in their
Yeah.
backyard, like that's what they did.
Yeah. So I want to go back to that. Like I want to have home funerals. I want people to have death be part of life again, I guess. I would love for people to like hang out in cemeteries and have that be normal. Um, like
Grab a
having
coffee, come sit.
picnics. Yeah, like just hanging out and have them
Hmm.
be beautiful spaces that are full of life instead of like landfills, essentially, which is what they are now. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, I also really want artists to be more involved in kind of the whole process. Like
Hmm.
why do caskets look the way they do? There's so many different ways that they could look.
Because
So I've
I
been
want
talking
something
to,
beautiful. Yeah, I want y'all to go. First of all, I want to be wrapped up and it's giving like, and I want my skin to shine. Like, make sure don't make me look dead. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
give me a little life to my face or whatever. And then like, I want to be wrapped up. I want flowers around. Like, I want it to be a whole
ooh,
experience.
Yeah.
And
Flowers are a big
I want
part of
people
it.
to dance. I want them to have, I want them to cry, do what you gotta do. But I want y'all to do things I would love to do. Like I just want to like I want people, I know people are gonna be sad, but I also want them to like also not be stressed about how am I gonna pay for the funeral and how am I gonna do this and like what happens with that. Like I just want people to actually be able to be 100% in their grief and like
Yeah.
to know that my life is completed and like it's all good.
Yeah. And I'm really right now kind of trying to figure out how to offer that to people, you know, because I want it to be inexpensive. And so, but we're not allowed to have nonprofit funeral homes in Texas, which sucks because I
Child,
would really
Texas
love
is
that.
something else. Texas
But
is
I do
something
want
else
to
in
help.
general.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I want to do this here. It'd be a lot
Yeah.
easier. I could move to Colorado and start working now without a license,
Hmm.
but like this is
Hmm.
where we need it. Um, but
Doing the good work.
yeah, like I'm also figuring out, like I just talked to somebody yesterday. They build like museum crates for like shipping fine art. And I've been like following them on Instagram for a while, and I was like, they could probably make a really cheap casket. And I
Yeah.
emailed them and I was like, would you be interested in doing this? And they were like so excited about it, you know? And so we could get like a cool casket made by these cool artists for
Hmm.
like $200, you
That
know?
part.
Uh, so
That
yeah, I
part.
want to
And
bring
still like
artists
support people,
to it.
right? Like still support people that are making the caskets and are doing the things and like, but just in a way that just isn't so fucking draining. Like someone has already died. There's already so much grief that comes with that. It shouldn't be complicated to do the process or whatever that process looks like. It should just not shouldn't be complicated. So I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
So in this, because we're talking about obviously being part of the deaf industry, being in school, being in
Hmm.
mortuary science, the hardships that come with that, um, and just the stress of like learning these processes that you're like, I never want to do, but like gotta learn to get through this
Hmm.
step. So, how are you taking care of yourself as you are in school and also as you are building the things that you're building?
Good question. Recently I've been realizing that the tools that I've used in the past are not cutting it anymore. And so I've actually like come to the realization that I need to find some new outlets. But um, you know, short answer is just connection, finding avenues for connection. Like nature is huge for me.
Mhm.
Throwing my body into a river is very important. But yeah, just like finding ways to connect, finding time to like journal and reflect and meditate and staying in my purpose and not getting bogged down by all the little details. And you know, people finding ways to make allies of people that might
Mhm.
look like enemies at first
Mhm.
has been really big, you know, just like being open-minded. My embalming
Mhm.
professor, for example, is some I was like really nervous about taking this class because I don't want to do it. I don't really like
Yeah.
being around it. And you know, he's turned out to be one of my biggest allies because he wants me to be successful, and that matters more to
Mhm.
him than his sort of preconceived notions and hatred for green burial. So
Mhm.
yeah, just connection, finding ways to connect as much as I can, as often as I can.
I love that. Well, I'm so proud of you because I know that
Mm,
it's a lot of shit. Like for real, like when you're in a space where you're learning things the old way, but you want to do them the new way, but you're also like, it's just like you have to be in these dual spaces all the time. And that in itself is exhausting. And then we just get into the politics of death, like, who's worthy of a good death, who's
mm.
worthy of that, who's worthy of being honored, who's worthy of not, like it's just it's a lot. So just wanna let you know that keep doing the good work, but also take care of yourself in the process. How should people reach you if they should need to reach out?
People can send me an email if they would like. I do some work with the Green Burial Council. So that's easy to remember, just Mara at greenburialcouncil.org. Um, And I will send you links for a couple of things for sure for the show that we have coming up
Mhm.
in February, Death Rights, where people can
Oh, yes.
follow
Mhm.
that. My Instagram is at Marbob, Marbobb. Um, is that enough? Enough
Yeah, that's
plugging?
perfect. Well, I thank you for your time, and I can't wait to see what comes of this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you.